Hi, my name is Wendy, and I'm here with New Deal Creative Arts Stories at 7. I'm reading The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. Today we will be reading the first half of Chapter 4, titled Martha. When Mary opened her eyes in the morning, it was because a young housemaid had come into her room to light the fire and was kneeling on the hearth rug, raking out the cinders noisily. Mary lay and watched her for a few moments and then began to look about the room. She had never seen a room at all like it and thought it curious and gloomy. The walls were covered with tapestry with a forest scene embroidered on it. There were fantastically dressed people under the trees, and in the distance there was a glimpse of the turrets of a castle. There were hunters and horses and dogs and ladies. Mary felt as if she were in the forest with them. Out of a deep window, she could see a great climbing stretch of land which seemed to have no trees on it and to look rather like an endless, dull, purplish sea. Here's a picture of the tapestry and the window. And here is a picture of the housemaid. "What is that?" she said, pointing out of the window. Martha, the young housemaid who had just risen to her feet, looked and pointed also. "That there," she said. "Yes." "That's the moor," she said with a good-natured grin. "Does thou like it?" "No," answered Mary. "I hate it." "That's because thou'rt not used to it," Martha said, going back to her hearth. "Thou thinks it's too big and bare now, but thou will like it." "Do you?" inquired Mary. "Aye, that I do," answered Martha, cheerfully polishing away at the grate. "I just love it. It's none bare. It's covered with growing things as smells sweet. It's fair lovely in spring and summer when the gorse and broom and heather's in flower. It smells of honey and there's such a lot of fresh air and the sky looks so high and the bees and skylarks make such a humming and a singing. I wouldn't live away from the moor for anything." Mary listened to her with a grave, puzzled expression. The servants she had been used to in India were not in the least like this. They did not presume to talk to their masters as if they were their equals. They made bows and called them protector of the poor and names of that sort. The servants there were commanded to do things and not asked. It was not the custom to say please and thank you, and Mary had always slapped her ayah in the face when she was angry. She wondered a little what this girl would do if one slapped her in the face. She was a round, rosy, good-natured-looking creature, but she had a sturdy way which made Mistress Mary wonder if she might not even slap back if the person who slapped her was only a little girl. "You are a strange servant," she said from her pillows rather haughtily. Martha sat up on her heels with her blacking brush in her hand and laughed without seeming the least bit out of temper. I know that," she said. "If there was a grand missus at Misselthwaite, I should never have been one of the under housemaids. I might have been let to the scullery maid, but I'd never have been let upstairs. I'm too common and I talk too much Yorkshire. But this is a funny house for all it's so grand. Seems like there's neither master nor mistress, except Mr. Pitcher and Mrs. Medlock. Mr. Craven, he won't be troubling about anything when he's here, and he's nearly always away. Mrs. Medlock gave me the place out of kindness. She told me she could never have done it if Misselthwaite had been like other big houses." "Are you going to be my servant?" Mary asked, still in her imperious way. Martha began to rub her grate again. "I'm Mrs. Medlock's servant," she said stoutly, "and she's Mr. Craven's. But I'm to do the housemaid's work up here and wait on you a bit, but you won't need much waiting on." "Who is going to dress me?" demanded Mary. Martha sat up on her heels again and stared. She spoke in broad Yorkshire in her amazement. "Canna the dress the sin?" she said. "What do you mean? I don't understand your language," said Mary. I forgot," Martha said. "Mrs. Medlock told me I'd have to be careful or you wouldn't know what I was saying. I mean, can't you just put on your own clothes?" "No," answered Mary quite indignantly. "I never did in my life. My ayah dressed me, of course." "Well," said Martha, evidently not in the least aware that she was impudent, "it's time they should learn. They cannot begin younger. It'll do thee good to wait on the sin a bit. My mother always said she couldn't see why grand people's children didn't turn out fair fools, what with nurses and being washed and dressed and took out to walk as if they was puppies." "It is different in India," said Mistress Mary disdainfully. She could scarcely stand this. Mary said. "You know nothing about India. You know nothing about anything." She was in such a rage and felt so hopeless before the girl's simple stare, and somehow she suddenly felt so horribly lonely and far away from everything she understood and which understood her, that she threw herself face downward on the pillows and burst into passionate sobbing. She sobbed so unrestrainedly that good-natured Yorkshire Martha was a little frightened and quite sorry for her. She went to the bed and bent over her. You mustn't cry like that there," she begged. "You mustn't for sure. I didn't know you'd be vexed. I don't know anything about anything, just like you said. I beg your pardon, miss. Do stop crying." There was something comforting and really friendly in her unusual Yorkshire speech and sturdy way, which had a good effect on Mary. She gradually ceased crying and became quiet. Martha looked relieved. "It's time for thee to get up now," she said. "Mrs. Medlock said I was to carry the breakfast and tea and dinner into the room next to this. It's been made into a nursery for thee. I'll help thee on with thy clothes if they'll get out of bed. If the buttons are at the back, they cannot dress them up themselves anyway." When Mary at last decided to get up, the clothes Martha took from the wardrobe were not the ones she had worn when she had arrived the night before with Mrs. Medlock. "Those are not my clothes," she said. "Mine are black." She looked the thick white wool coat and dress over and added with cool approval, "Those are nicer than mine." "These are the ones they must put on," Martha answered. "Mr. Craven ordered Mrs. Medlock to get 'em in London. He said, 'I won't have a child dressed in black wandering about like a lost soul,' he said. 'It'd make the place sadder than it is. Put colour on her.' Mother said she knew what he meant. Mother always knows what a body means. She doesn't hold with children wearing black clothes herself." "I hate black things," said Mary. The dressing process was one which taught them both something. Martha had buttoned up her little sisters and brothers, but she had never seen a child who stood still and waited for another person to do things for her as if she had neither hands nor feet of her own. "Why doesn't they put on their own boots?" she said when Mary quietly held out her foot. "My ayah did it," answered Mary, staring. "It was the custom." She said that very often. It was the custom. It had not been the custom that Mistress Mary should do anything but stand and allow herself to be dressed like a doll. But before she was ready for breakfast, she began to suspect that her life at Misselthwaite Manor would end by teaching her a number of things quite new to her, things such as putting on her own shoes and stockings and picking up things she let fall. If Martha had been a well-trained, fine young lady's maid, she would have been more subservient and respectful, and would have known that it was her business to brush hair and button boots and pick things up and lay them away. She was, however, only an untrained Yorkshire girl who had been brought up in a cottage with a lot of little brothers and sisters who had never dreamed of doing anything but waiting on themselves and on the younger ones who were either babies or just learning to totter about and tumble over things. If Mary Lennox had been a child who was ready to be amused, she would perhaps have laughed at Martha's readiness to talk. But Mary only listened to her coldly and wondered at her freedom of manner. At first she was not at all interested, but gradually, as the girl rattled on in her good-tempered, friendly way, Mary began to notice what Martha was saying. You should see 'em all," she said. "There's 12 of us, and my father only gets 16 shillin' a week. I can tell you my mother's fair put to it to get porridge for 'em all. They tumble about on the moor and play there all day, and mother says the air of the moor fattens 'em. She believes they eat the grass the same as wild ponies do. Our Dickon, he's 12 years old, and he's got a young pony he calls his own." "Where did he get it?" asked Mary. "He found it on the moor and with its mother, and when it was a little one, and he began to make friends with it and give it bits of bread and pluck young grass for it, and it got to like him, so it follows him about and it lets him get on its back. Dickon's a kind lad, and animals like him." Mary had never possessed an animal pet of her own, and had always thought she should like one. So she began to feel a slight interest in Dickon. And as she had never been interested in anyone but herself, it was the dawning of a healthy sentiment. When she went into the room which had been made into a nursery for her, she found that it was rather like the one she had slept in. It was not a child's room, but a grown-up person's room with gloomy old pictures on the walls and heavy old oak chairs. A table in the center was set with a good substantial breakfast, but she had always had a very small appetite, and she looked with something more than indifference at the first plate Martha set before her. "I don't want it," she said. "That doesn't want the porridge." Martha exclaimed incredulously. No. Thee doesn't know how good it is. Put a bit of treacle on it or a bit of sugar. I don't want it, repeated Mary. Said Martha, I can't abide to see good food put to waste. If our children was at this table, they'd clean it bare in 5 minutes. Why? Said Mary coldly. Why? Echoed Martha. Because they scarce ever had their stomachs full in their lives. They're as hungry as young hawks and foxes. I don't know what it is to be hungry, said Mary with the indifference of ignorance. Martha looked indignant. Well, it would do thee good to try it. I can see that plain enough, she said outspokenly. I've no patience with folks as sits and stares at good bread and meat. My word, don't I wish Dickon and Phil and Jane and the rest of 'em had what's here under their pinafores. Why don't you take it to them? Suggested Mary. It's not mine, answered Martha, and this isn't my day out. I get my day out once a month, same as the rest. Then I go home and clean up for Mother and give her a day's rest. Mary drank some tea and ate a little toast and some marmalade. You wrap up warm and run out and play, you, said Martha. It'll do you good and give you stomach for your meat. Mary went to the window. There were gardens and paths and big trees, but everything looked dull and wintry. Out? Why should I go out on a day like this? Well, if they doesn't go out, they'll have to stay in. And what's they got to do? Mary glanced about her. There was nothing to do. When Mrs. Medlock had prepared the nursery, she had not thought of amusement. Perhaps it would be better to go and see what the gardens were like. Who will go with me? She inquired. Martha stared. You'll go by yourself, she answered. You'll have to learn to play like other children does when they haven't got brothers and sisters. Our Dickon goes off on the moor by himself and plays for hours. That's how he made friends with the pony. He's got sheep on the moor that knows him and birds as comes and eats out of his hand. However little there is to eat, he always saves a bit of bread to coax his pets. It was really this mention of Dickon which made Mary decide to go out, though she was not aware of it. There would be birds outside, though there would not be ponies or sheep. They would be different from the birds in India, and it might amuse her to look at them. Martha found her coat and hat for her and a pair of stout little boots, and she showed her the way downstairs. If they goes round that way, they'll come to the gardens, she said, pointing to a gate in a wall of shrubbery. There's lots of flowers in summer time, but there's nothing bloomin' now. She seemed to hesitate a second before she added, One of the gardens is locked up. No one has been in it for 10 years. Why? Asked Mary, in spite of herself. Here was another locked door that added to the 100 inside the strange house. Mr. Craven had it shut when his wife died so sudden. He won't let no one go inside. It was her garden. He locked the door and dug a hole and buried the key. There's Mrs. Medlock's bell ring, and I must run. After she was gone, Mary turned down the walk which led to the door in the shrubbery. She could not help thinking about the garden which no one had been inside for 10 years. She wondered what it would look like and whether there were any flowers still alive in it. Here's Mary walking up into the gardens. When she had passed through the shrubbery gate, she found herself in great gardens with wide lawns and winding walks with clipped borders. There were trees and flower beds and evergreens clipped into strange shapes, and a large pool with an old gray fountain in its midst. But the flower beds were bare and wintry, and the fountain was not playing. This was not the garden which was shut up. How could a garden be shut up? You could always walk into a garden. Here she is walking into the bigger garden. You can see that the tree is clipped into a strange shape, 2 big balls. She was just thinking this when she saw that at the end of the path she was following, there seemed to be a long wall with ivy growing over it. She was not familiar enough with England to know that she was coming upon the kitchen gardens where the vegetables and fruit were growing. She went towards the wall and found that there was a green door in the ivy and that it stood open. This was not the closed garden, evidently, and she could go into it. And here is where we will stop, and we'll resume with chapter 4 tomorrow.